Have you ever wondered if the Bible you know is the only Bible that Christians have read throughout history? Most people assume the biblical canon has always been the same everywhere, but deep in the highlands of Ethiopia, an ancient Christian tradition has preserved a biblical collection that includes books Western Christianity rejected centuries ago. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church guards what they call the Mishafa Kudus, containing over 80 sacred texts. Among these are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other writings that offer strikingly different perspectives on familiar stories. And once we understand this first layer, the real story begins. The Ethiopian Bible represents one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth. While European Christianity was still emerging from Roman persecution, Ethiopian believers were already establishing monasteries and copying scriptures in their ancient Ge'ez language. These communities preserved texts that other branches of Christianity deemed too controversial, too mystical, or too challenging to establish doctrine. The question we must ask is simple but profound. What did these ancient Christians see in these texts that made them worth preserving for 2,000 years? The books found in the Ethiopian canon, but absent from Western Bibles, are not minor footnotes. They contain detailed accounts of the heavenly realm, the activities of angels before human creation, and the complex interactions between divine beings and humanity. First Enoch alone spans over 100 chapters, describing visions of heaven, angelic hierarchies, and the origins of evil in ways Genesis only hints at. Jubilees retells the entire narrative from creation to Moses, adding layers of detail about angelic involvement in human history that completely reframe our understanding of Old Testament events. Western church councils made deliberate choices about which books to include in their Bibles. The Council of Laodicea in 363 AD, and later the Council of Carthage in 397 AD, established canons that excluded texts like Enoch and Jubilees. The reasons given were often vague. Some church fathers claimed these books lacked apostolic authority. Others suggested their theology was inconsistent with emerging Orthodox doctrine. But the Ethiopian church, isolated by geography and politics, continued to regard these texts as divinely inspired scripture, equal in authority to Genesis or Isaiah. What makes this particularly fascinating is that the New Testament itself quotes from some of these excluded books. The Epistle of Jude directly references the Book of Enoch, even quoting it by name in Jude 1:14-15. This creates an intriguing paradox. If a New Testament author considered Enoch authoritative enough to quote in inspired scripture, why did later church councils reject it? The Ethiopian tradition never faced this contradiction because they never excluded Enoch in the first place. The theological implications of including these texts are enormous. They present a cosmos far more populated with intelligent beings than the simplified Western narrative suggests. They describe a spiritual realm with complex politics, factions, and conflicts. They portray human history as shaped not just by God's sovereign will, but by the actions and choices of lesser divine beings with their own agendas. This is not the tidy, controlled universe of Sunday school lessons. This is a biblical worldview where spiritual warfare is literal, where angels can rebel, where divine beings can corrupt human genetics, and where humanity exists in the middle of conflicts we barely understand. Subscribe now to explore the mysteries hidden in the world's most ancient biblical tradition and discover what happens when we read familiar stories through the lens of texts that most Christians never knew existed. For centuries, Western scholars dismissed the Ethiopian Bible as a curiosity, an exotic variant with little theological significance. But recent biblical scholarship has begun to recognize that the Ethiopian tradition may preserve elements of ancient Jewish and early Christian belief that were later suppressed or forgotten. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, contained fragments of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic, proving that this text was indeed circulating among Jewish communities in the centuries before Christ. Suddenly, the Ethiopian church's insistence on including Enoch didn't seem so strange after all. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition claims an unbroken lineage back to the Ethiopian eunuch baptized by Philip in Acts Whether historically verifiable or not, this claim reflects a deep conviction that their biblical collection represents authentic ancient Christianity, unfiltered by later European theological developments. They see their expanded canon not as an addition but as a preservation of what was always meant to be included. From their perspective, it is Western Christianity that removed books, not Ethiopia that added them. As we journey through this exploration, we will examine specific texts, specific claims, and specific theological challenges that the Ethiopian Bible presents. We will look at how these ancient writings describe the nature of God, the role of angels, the origins of humanity, and the meaning of redemption. We will ask uncomfortable questions about why certain perspectives were suppressed and what we might learn by recovering them. And we will discover that the story of the Bible itself is far more complex and contested than most believers realize. But what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about Genesis. Chapter 2, the Elohim Enigma. What if the most fundamental word in the Bible has been mistranslated for centuries? Genesis 1001 opens with these words in Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim. English Bibles translate this as, in the beginning, God created. But there is a linguistic problem that has troubled Hebrew scholars for millennia. The word Elohim is grammatically plural. Its singular form would be Eloheia. So why does the Bible use a plural word for God right from the very first sentence? Traditional Jewish and Christian theology explains this as the plural of majesty, similar to how royalty might say we when referring to themselves. This interpretation preserves monotheism by suggesting that the plural form is simply an expression of God's greatness, not an indication of multiple divine beings. But the Ethiopian biblical tradition, influenced by texts like Enoch and Jubilees, takes the plural seriously. In their reading, Elohim does not refer to one being with a majestic title. It refers to a category of beings, a divine council, a heavenly assembly. Genesis 1:26 intensifies this mystery. God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." The plural pronouns are impossible to ignore. Who is God speaking to? Traditional Christian theology offers several explanations. Some say God is addressing the Trinity, with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in conversation. Others suggest God is speaking to angels, though they are not described as participating in the creation of humanity. But the Ethiopian texts offer a different explanation. They suggest that Elohim is not one God speaking to himself or to passive observers. Elohim is a council of divine authorities who collectively decided to create humanity. This interpretation is not pulled from thin air. Psalm 82 describes a scene where God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. The Hebrew word translated gods here is again Elohim. The psalm continues, accusing these Elohim of judging unjustly and showing favoritism to the wicked. It even declares that these gods will die like men. If Elohim simply meant the one true God, this passage makes no sense. But if Elohim refers to a class of divine beings, the psalm describes a judgment scene where the Most High holds lesser divine authorities accountable for their corruption. Like this video if you have ever wondered why the Bible uses plural language for God, and keep watching as we uncover what ancient texts reveal about this divine council. The Book of Enoch, fully canonical in the Ethiopian tradition, describes these divine beings in detail. It names specific angels, assigns them specific roles, and describes their positions in a heavenly hierarchy. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel are presented not just as messengers but as archangels with authority over specific aspects of creation. Beneath them are countless angels organized into orders and ranks, each with designated functions. This is not a vague spiritual realm. This is a structured government, a bureaucracy of the heavens. Jubilees goes even further, describing how God created angels on the first day of creation before light itself. These angels were assigned to govern natural phenomena, angels of the presence, angels of sanctification, angels over fire, wind, clouds, darkness, snow, hail, and every natural process. Humanity created on the sixth day. entered a cosmos already populated and organized by these prior intelligences. We were not the first creation. We were not even the most powerful. We were placed into a universe already governed by beings far older and more knowledgeable than ourselves. This raises a profound theological question. If these Elohim existed before humanity and were given authority over aspects of creation, what is their relationship to the Most High God? Are they servants, extensions of His will, or do they possess independent agency? Can they act in ways contrary to His intentions? The Ethiopian texts suggest that while these beings were created good, some exercised their freedom in destructive ways. The rebellion of angels is not a minor subplot in this tradition. It is central to understanding human history. Deuteronomy 32,008 provides another intriguing clue. The passage states, when the Most High divided the nations, when He separated the sons of Adam, He set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the angels of God. For the Lord's portion is His people. Jacob is the lot of His inheritance. This suggests that different nations were assigned to different members of the divine council, with Israel reserved for the Most High Himself. If taken literally, this passage implies a form of cosmic territorialism where different Elohim were given authority over different peoples. Daniel 10 reinforces this idea. The angel speaking to Daniel explains that he was delayed in coming because the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. This prince of Persia is not a human ruler, but a spiritual entity with authority over a nation. The text describes a conflict between angelic powers, with Michael intervening on behalf of God's purposes. This is not the serene, orderly heaven of popular Christian imagination. This is a contested realm where spiritual beings vie for influence over human affairs. The Ethiopian reading of these passages suggests that what we call spiritual warfare is not merely metaphorical. It is a description of real conflicts between members of the divine council with different agendas. Some remain loyal to the Most High's purposes. Others have chosen rebellion. Humanity exists in the middle of this conflict, often unaware that our decisions and our history are influenced by powers we cannot see. Yet the question remains, if these beings are so powerful, what does that mean for human freedom and divine sovereignty? The answer lies deeper in the Ethiopian texts, and it is more unsettling than you might expect. Chapter 3, A Council in the Heavens. Scripture reveals that heaven operates with structure, order, and hierarchy. Isaiah 6 described the prophet's vision of the Lord seated on a throne, surrounded by seraphim calling out, "Holy, holy, holy." Ezekiel 1 presents an even more elaborate vision with living creatures, wheels within wheels, and a throne of sapphire. Revelation 4 shows 24 elders and 4 living creatures around God's throne, engaged in perpetual worship. These are not random images, they depict a heavenly government and organized administration of the cosmos. The Ethiopian Book of Enoch expands on these visions with remarkable specificity. It describes 7 archangels who stand in the presence of the glory of the Lord. Michael is named as the merciful and patient one. Raphael is set over all disease and every wound of the children of men. Gabriel is over paradise, the serpents and the cherubim. Uriel is set over the world and Tartarus. Each archangel has a domain, a responsibility, a sphere of authority. This is not poetic language. This is administrative structure. Beneath the archangels, Enoch describes orders of angels, the watchers, the holy ones, the angels of power, the angels of principalities. Each order has specific functions. Some govern natural forces like weather and seasons. Others are assigned to watch over nations and peoples. Still others serve as messengers between heaven and earth. The cosmos, in this understanding, is not chaotic. It is governed, managed, and structured by a vast hierarchy of intelligent beings. But here is where the Ethiopian tradition introduces a disturbing complication. Not all members of this divine council remained faithful to their created purpose. Enoch describes a group of watchers, 200 in number, who descended to Mount Hermon and swore an oath together. Their leader was named Semyaza, and under his influence, these watchers took human women as wives. This is the event briefly mentioned in Genesis 6:1-4, where the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Comment below if you have ever read Genesis 6 and wondered who these sons of God really were, and what it means that they produced offspring with humans. In the Western Christian tradition, this passage is often glossed over or interpreted metaphorically. Some scholars suggest the sons of God were merely the righteous line of Seth intermarrying with the corrupt line of Cain, but the Ethiopian tradition, with the full text of Enoch available, reads this passage literally. The sons of God were members of the divine council, angels who violated the boundary between heaven and earth. Their offspring, called Nephilim in Hebrew and giants in English translations, were hybrid beings, part divine and part human. Enoch provides disturbing details about what these watchers taught humanity. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor, introducing the technology of warfare. Semyaza taught enchantments and root cutting, the foundations of sorcery. Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barachel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds. Arakel taught the signs of the earth. Shamshel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. These were not benevolent gifts of civilization. These were forbidden knowledge. Techniques that gave humanity power without wisdom. Technology without ethics. When humans could no longer sustain them, the Nephilim turned on humanity, devouring people and drinking their blood. Violence, corruption, and bloodshed filled the earth. The cosmic order established at creation was collapsing, and the Most High had to intervene. But the intervention was not a simple punishment. It was a cosmic reset, a flood designed to cleanse the earth of genetic and spiritual corruption. This narrative reframes Genesis 6:9 entirely. The flood was not primarily about human sin, though humanity was certainly corrupt. The flood was about undoing the damage caused by the Watchers' rebellion. It was about eliminating the Nephilim and their corrupted bloodlines. It was about restoring the boundary between heaven and earth that the Watchers had violated. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord not just because he was righteous, but because his genealogy was uncontaminated. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah as perfect in his generations, a phrase that in Hebrew can mean genetically pure, unmixed. The Ethiopian tradition takes seriously the idea that the angelic rebellion was not just spiritual but physical, affecting the very biology of life on earth. This is not the sanitized Sunday school story of a flood caused by human wickedness. This is a narrative about cosmic warfare, genetic corruption, and divine intervention to preserve the human species from extinction or complete contamination. And if this sounds too strange to be biblical, remember that Jude 1006 speaks of angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, kept in everlasting chains for judgment. Peter echoes this in Peter 2:4, stating that God cast down to hell the angels who sinned, confining them in chains of darkness. The New Testament authors knew this story. They referenced it. They believed it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that the biblical worldview is far more complex than modern Christianity often acknowledges, and that ancient believers understood dimensions of spiritual reality we have forgotten. What is most challenging about the Ethiopian reading is that it removes the neat separation between the physical and spiritual realms that much of Western theology assumes. In this understanding, spiritual beings can interact with physical reality in tangible ways. They can produce offspring, they can teach technology, they can alter genetics. The boundary between heaven and earth is not impermeable. It can be crossed, and when it is crossed improperly, the consequences are devastating. If members of the Divine Council rebelled once, could they rebel again, and are they still influencing human history? Chapter 4, The Divine Assembly and Human Origins. Let us return to the moment of human creation with fresh eyes. Genesis 1:26 records God saying, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." Traditional theology interprets this as the Trinity in conversation. But the Ethiopian texts, read alongside ancient Jewish interpretations, suggest something more complex. The divine council was convened, a proposal was made, and the creation of humanity was a decision reached by this assembly, not a unilateral declaration. The Book of Jubilees provides additional detail. It describes how on the sixth day, after creating animals, God spoke to the angels and said, "Let us make man in our image." The text emphasizes that humanity would be created with a unique capacity, the ability to rule over the earth and its creatures. But this capacity came with a danger. Humanity would possess intelligence, creativity, and freedom similar to the angels themselves. Some angels, according to later traditions preserved in Jewish mysticism, objected. They feared that humanity would become corrupt, that they would rebel, that they would cause chaos. These objections were not baseless. The angels could see possibilities that God, in his omniscience, already knew. They could foresee human rebellion, violence, and idolatry. Some traditions suggest that certain angels argued against creating humanity altogether, but the Most High overruled these objections. Humanity would be created, and they would be given something remarkable, the image of God himself. But what does it mean to be created in the image of Elohim, if Elohim is not one being but a category? The Hebrew word for image is selamai. It can mean a physical likeness, but it also carries connotations of representation, resemblance, and function. Ancient Near Eastern kings would place their image, their telemon, in distant territories as a symbol of their authority. The image represented the king's presence and power. To create humanity in the image of Elohim suggests that humans were designed to represent divine authority on earth. We were meant to function as God's representatives, his vice-regents, governing creation on his behalf. But here is the controversial part. If we are created in the image of a divine council, then we reflect not just the nature of the Most High, but also the capacities of the Elohim. We possess intelligence, creativity, moral reasoning, and freedom of choice. These are not merely human attributes. They are divine attributes. We are not gods, but we are made godlike, bearing capacities that belong to the heavenly realm. This is both our glory and our danger. Psalm 8 captures this paradox beautifully. David writes, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor." The Hebrew word translated angels here is Elohim. The verse literally says, "You have made him a little lower than Elohim." Humanity was created as the junior members of the divine council, positioned just beneath the angels, but above all other earthly creatures. This explains why the serpent's temptation in Genesis 3 was so potent. The serpent did not promise Eve something completely foreign to her nature. He promised that eating the forbidden fruit would make her like Elohim, knowing good and evil. This was not a lie. It was a half-truth. Humanity was already like Elohim in many ways. The forbidden knowledge would complete the resemblance, but at a cost. It would mean grasping authority and knowledge that was meant to be received as a gift, not seized through rebellion. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next chapter, where we explore what happened when angels disagreed about humanity's purpose and some decided to intervene directly. The Ethiopian tradition emphasizes that humanity's creation was not a simple act of divine breath. It was a complex process involving the assembly of elements, the shaping of form, and the infusion of spirit. Genesis 2007 states, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." The word formed in Hebrew is yatzah, the same word used to describe a potter shaping clay. This implies intentionality, craftsmanship, and deliberation. Jubilees adds that Adam was created on the sixth day in the first week, and that he was placed in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and guard it. The word guard is significant. What was Adam guarding against? The text implies that even in paradise there were forces that might seek to intrude, to corrupt, to rebel. Adam was not placed in a static, safe environment. He was placed in a garden that required vigilance, suggesting that even before the fall, the spiritual realm contained potential threats. The creation of Eve introduces another layer. Genesis 2 describes God causing a deep sleep to fall on Adam, taking one of his ribs and fashioning Eve from it. The Hebrew word for rib, selah, can also mean side, suggesting that Eve was not a minor addition but a co-equal partner formed from Adam's very essence. Together, they represented the fullness of the divine image, male and female, reflecting the relational nature of the divine counsel itself. What is crucial to understand is that humanity was not created in isolation. We were placed into a cosmos already populated by the Elohim, already structured by angelic hierarchies, already governed by spiritual authorities. Our existence was not the beginning of the story. It was a new chapter in a story that had been unfolding long before us. And some members of that story did not welcome our arrival. They saw humanity as a threat, a competitor, or an opportunity for exploitation. And that is when the rebellion began. Chapter 5. When angels disagreed, the Book of Enoch presents a troubling narrative that mainstream Christianity has avoided for centuries. It describes how a group of angels, called Watchers, became fascinated with humanity. Genesis 6:2 states, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose." The Ethiopian tradition does not spiritualize this. It reads it as a literal account of angelic beings crossing a forbidden boundary. Enoch names the leaders of this rebellion. Simyazer was their chief, and with him were 19 other leaders, each commanding 10 angels, totaling 200. They descended to Mount Hermon, a location whose name in Hebrew means devoted to destruction. There they swore an oath, binding themselves together in their transgression. This was not a spontaneous act, it was premeditated, organized, and collective. They knew they were violating divine order, and they pledged mutual accountability, knowing that their rebellion would bring judgment. The text describes their marriages to human women and the birth of the Nephilim. These beings grew to enormous size, consuming vast resources and eventually turning violent. But the corruption went deeper than physical violence. The Watchers taught humanity knowledge that was not meant to be revealed. This was not simply advanced technology. It was knowledge that altered the moral and spiritual fabric of human civilization. Humanity gained power without the wisdom to use it responsibly. Azazil's teachings are particularly significant. He taught men to forge weapons of war, introducing organized violence on a scale previously unknown. Before the Watchers' intervention, human conflicts were limited by the primitive tools available. After their teachings, humanity possessed the means for large-scale warfare, conquest, and destruction. Enoch presents this not as progress but as corruption. It was a gift that accelerated humanity's capacity for evil. The teachings of sorcery, astrology, and divination introduced another kind of corruption. These practices opened doors to spiritual forces that humanity was not equipped to handle. They gave humans the illusion of control over fate and nature, leading to idolatry and the worship of the Watchers themselves. The line between the creator and created beings became blurred. Humanity began offering worship and sacrifice to angels, demons, and the spirits of the deceased Nephilim, rather than to the Most High alone. Genesis 6:5 summarizes the result. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This was not mere moral failure. This was comprehensive corruption, affecting thought, intention, and action. The Hebrew word for every intent suggests a totality, a completeness of corruption that left no aspect of human nature unaffected. And the source of this corruption, according to the Ethiopian texts, was the Watchers' intervention. Like this video if you are beginning to see the Genesis flood story in a completely new light, and stay with us as we uncover why the flood was not just about judgment, but about genetic preservation. The Most High's response, according to Enoch, was swift and multifaceted. He commanded the archangels to take action. Uriel was sent to warn Noah of the coming flood. Raphael was instructed to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into darkness, covering him with rough and jagged rocks until the day of judgment. Gabriel was sent to destroy the Nephilim by inciting them to fight among themselves. Michael was commanded to bind Semiramis and the other leaders for 70 generations until the day of their final judgment. This was not a simple act of divine wrath. It was a coordinated operation to dismantle the structures of rebellion, remove the corrupted beings, and preserve a remnant of uncorrupted humanity through Noah. The flood, in this reading, was not primarily a punishment for human sin. It was a necessary intervention to prevent the complete genetic and spiritual corruption of the human race. If the process had continued unchecked, humanity would have ceased to exist in its created form. But the story does not end with the flood. Enoch describes how the spirits of the deceased Nephilim, being hybrid beings without a place in the natural order, became wandering demons, unlike angels who have their place in the heavenly realm, and humans whose spirits await resurrection. The Nephilim had no appointed destination after death. Their spirits remained on earth, seeking to inhabit and influence humanity. This, the text suggests, is the origin of demonic activity. This narrative provides a framework for understanding the New Testament's descriptions of spiritual warfare. When Jesus cast out demons, he was not dealing with metaphorical evils or psychological conditions. He was confronting literal spiritual entities, the remnants of the Watcher's rebellion, still active and still seeking to corrupt humanity. The Apostle Paul's descriptions of principalities and powers in Ephesians 6 are not poetic language. They are references to organized spiritual forces with hierarchy, strategy, and malevolent intent. The Ethiopian tradition's preservation of Enoch makes the New Testament's spiritual warfare language comprehensible. Without Enoch, the references to fallen angels, bound spirits, and demonic hierarchies seem disconnected from the Old Testament narrative. With Enoch, they become part of the continuous story stretching from before human creation to the final judgment. The rebellion of the Watchers was not a minor event. It was the catastrophe that shaped all subsequent human history. Yet what happened after the flood was even more significant, because the corruption did not end, it adapted. Chapter 6. The corruption of bloodlines. The flood was meant to cleanse the earth, to erase the genetic corruption introduced by the Watchers' rebellion. Noah and his family were chosen because they were genetically pure, uncontaminated by Nephilim bloodlines. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah as perfect in his generations, a phrase that emphasizes genealogical purity. The Hebrew word tamim can mean complete, whole, or without blemish, the same word used to describe sacrificial animals that must be unblemished. Noah's lineage was uncorrupted, but Genesis 6:4 contains a troubling detail often overlooked. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The phrase "and also afterward" indicates that Nephilim appeared not only before the flood, but after it as well. How is this possible if the flood destroyed all corrupted beings? The Ethiopian texts and later Jewish commentaries offer two primary explanations. Either some Nephilim bloodlines survived through Noah's sons' wives, or the Watcher's influence resumed after the flood through different means. Numbers 13 describes the Israelite spies reporting on the inhabitants of Canaan. There, we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. The Anakim, descendants of Anak, were identified as Nephilim. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 mention other giant peoples, the Emim, the Zamzamim, and the Rephaim. King Og of Bashan was described as the last of the remnant of the giants, with a bed measuring 13.5 feet long. These were not symbolic giants of folklore. These were literal populations of extraordinarily large humans possessing physical characteristics that set them apart from ordinary people. The biblical text treats them as historical realities, not myths, and the Israelites' conquest of Canaan in this context takes on new significance. It was not merely a military campaign for territory. It was a continuation of the mission to eliminate corrupted bloodlines, to remove the remnants of the Watchers' rebellion from the earth. 1 Samuel 17 presents David's confrontation with Goliath in this light. Goliath is described as over 9 feet tall, wearing armor weighing 125 pounds, carrying a spear with a head weighing 15 pounds. He was not a normal human. He was likely a descendant of the Nephilim, a representative of the corrupted bloodlines that Israel was commanded to destroy. David's victory was not just a military triumph. It was a spiritual victory over forces that had plagued humanity since before the flood. The Ethiopian tradition suggests that the post-flood appearance of Nephilim was evidence that spiritual warfare continued. Even though the original Watchers were bound, their influence persisted through the demons that roamed the earth and through residual genetic corruption that occasionally manifested in giant offspring. The earth was a contested realm, with the forces of rebellion constantly seeking to re-establish their foothold. Comment below if this interpretation of the conquest of Canaan changes how you understand those difficult Old Testament passages where God commands the complete destruction of certain peoples. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of Old Testament theology, the herem or ban, the command to completely destroy certain Canaanite populations, including women and children. Modern readers find these passages morally disturbing. How could a loving God command genocide? But the Ethiopian reading, with the full context of Enoch and Jubilees, suggests these were not ordinary human populations. They were populations with Nephilim ancestry, carriers of genetic corruption that threatened to spread throughout humanity. Deuteronomy 20 distinguishes between how Israel should treat distant cities and how they should treat Canaanite cities. Distant cities could be offered terms of peace. Canaanite cities were to be completely destroyed, with no survivors. The text specifically names 6 nations: the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. These were the populations most associated with giant ancestry and with religious practices that involved interaction with demonic forces. The rationale given in Deuteronomy 20:18 is revealing, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. The concern was not merely cultural or religious contamination, it was spiritual and genetic contamination, a repetition of the corruption that necessitated the flood. Israel's mission was to establish a pure people, a nation through whom the promised Messiah would eventually come. Any compromise with Nephilim-descended populations risked corrupting the messianic lineage. This explains the otherwise puzzling emphasis in biblical genealogies. The long lists of names that modern readers often skip were not mere record-keeping. They were proof of genealogical purity, documentation that the line from Adam through Noah, through Abraham, through David to Jesus remained uncontaminated. Matthew's Gospel opens with a genealogy precisely to establish Jesus' legitimate descent from David and Abraham. This was not about legal inheritance alone. It was about genetic purity. The Ethiopian tradition's inclusion of Jubilees makes this emphasis explicit. Jubilees repeatedly stresses the importance of marrying within the covenant community, avoiding intermarriage with Canaanites, and maintaining genealogical purity. This is not ethnic prejudice. This is a theological necessity, a recognition that the promised seed who would crush the serpent's head and redeem humanity must come from an uncorrupted human lineage. Any contamination of that lineage would compromise the redemptive plan. Yet the question remains, if the bloodlines were so important, what did the flood actually accomplish? Chapter 7, The Flood as Divine Reset. The Genesis flood narrative is familiar to most Bible readers, but the Ethiopian texts reframe it entirely. This was not a story about God losing patience with human sin. This was a story about a world collapsing under the weight of genetic and spiritual corruption, and the God who intervened to preserve the human species from extinction. The flood was not merely judgment, it was rescue. Genesis 6 sets the stage. Human wickedness was great. Violence filled the earth. But the text also mentions the Nephilim and the sons of God taking human wives. These details are not incidental, they are the root cause of the corruption described in verse 5. The earth was corrupt because the created order had been violated. Angels had crossed boundaries. Hybrid beings had multiplied. Forbidden knowledge had been disseminated. The entire structure of creation was unraveling. Enoch provides additional context. The text describes how the blood of the slain cried out to heaven. The archangels brought the case before the Most High, reporting on the chaos caused by the Watchers and the Nephilim. The earth itself was groaning under the violence and corruption, and the Most High declared that the earth would be cleansed. Everything would be destroyed except for Noah and his family. But why Noah? Genesis 6:8 states, "Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." The next verse adds that Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. The word perfect here is critical. It does not merely mean morally upright. It means complete, whole, uncontaminated. Noah's lineage was pure. His genealogy had not been compromised by Nephilim ancestry. He represented the last uncorrupted branch of the human family tree. The flood was catastrophic, but it was also precise. It targeted the corrupted populations while preserving the pure line. The waters covered the earth, destroying all flesh that breathed air, except for those in the ark. The Nephilim were drowned, the Watchers were bound. The demons that resulted from the Nephilim's deaths were left without physical bodies, forced to wander as disembodied spirits. The earth was reset, but the reset was not complete. Genesis 9:1 records God blessing Noah and his sons, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." This was a second creation mandate, a restart of the human project, but the presence of Nephilim afterward, as Genesis 6:4 notes, indicates that the problem had not been entirely solved. The flood removed the most severe corruption, but it did not eliminate the spiritual forces that caused it. The demons remained. The influence of the Watchers persisted. The battle continued. Jubilees adds that after the flood, Noah offered sacrifices, and God made a covenant with him, promising never again to destroy the earth with water. But the covenant came with conditions. Humanity was commanded not to eat blood, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. This prohibition takes on new significance in the context of genetic corruption. Blood represents genetic continuity, the transmission of life from generation to generation. Eating blood symbolically violates the sanctity of that transmission. Share this video to help others see the flood story not as divine cruelty, but as divine intervention to save humanity from genetic extinction. The rainbow, given as the sign of the covenant, represents God's commitment to preserve the earth despite ongoing corruption. It is a promise that the reset, though imperfect, would stand. The human project would continue, the messianic plan would unfold, and despite the presence of ongoing spiritual warfare, the ultimate victory was assured. The flood narrative also establishes an important principle. God will intervene when corruption threatens the survival or purity of his redemptive plan. This was not the last such intervention. The conquest of Canaan was another. The captivity and return of Israel were another. And ultimately, the incarnation of Christ was the final and decisive intervention, breaking the power of corruption at its source. The Ethiopian tradition's emphasis on the flood as a genetic reset challenges modern readers to take seriously the physical dimensions of spiritual warfare. We tend to separate the spiritual and the physical, treating them as independent realms. But the biblical worldview, especially as preserved in the Ethiopian canon, sees them as deeply interconnected. Spiritual rebellion has physical consequences. Genetic corruption is not merely biological. It is a spiritual issue with biological manifestations, and God's interventions addressed both dimensions simultaneously. Yet if the flood did not end the corruption, what happened when humanity tried to unite again? Chapter 8. Babel and the Fear of Unity. Genesis 11 opens with humanity speaking one language and settling in the land of Shinar. They decide to build a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. This is often taught as a story about human pride, an attempt to reach God through human effort. But the Ethiopian texts suggest something more complex. Babel was not merely about pride, it was about knowledge, unity, and the fear that united humanity would become ungovernable. The text records their motivation. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. They were resisting God's command in Genesis 9:1 to fill the earth. Instead of spreading out, they were consolidating. Instead of diversity, they sought uniformity. And the tower was not just a monument to human achievement. It was a structure designed to access the heavens, to cross the boundary between earth and the spiritual realm. Ancient Near Eastern ziggurats, which the Tower of Babel likely resembled, were not just temples. They were portals, locations where priests performed rituals to contact gods, receive divine knowledge, and maintain cosmic order. The Hebrew word Migdal, translated tower, can refer to fortified structures, but also to elevated platforms for ritual purposes. Babel was not a skyscraper. It was a gate to the heavens, a human-initiated attempt to re-establish contact with the divine realm. Genesis 11:6 records God's response, "Indeed the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them." This statement is remarkable. God acknowledges that unified humanity with shared language and purpose has almost unlimited potential. There is no technological or intellectual barrier they cannot overcome. And this is presented not as a compliment, but as a problem. Why would human unity and progress be a problem? The Ethiopian tradition suggests that post-flood humanity still carried the corrupting influence of the Watcher's teachings. They still possessed knowledge of sorcery, astrology, and warfare, and if they remained unified, they would collectively pursue paths that would lead to another catastrophic rebellion, potentially worse than the first. The division of languages and the scattering of nations was not punishment, it was protection. Deuteronomy 32:8 provides crucial context, as we noted earlier. The Most High divided the nations according to the number of the angels. Different peoples were assigned to different members of the divine council. This was not arbitrary, it was strategic. By dividing humanity, God limited the damage any one rebellious member of the council could inflict. No single spiritual power could dominate all of humanity. The division created a system of checks and balances in the spiritual realm, but this division also created a problem. If different nations were under the authority of different Elohim, and some of those Elohim were corrupt, then those nations would be led into idolatry and false worship. This is exactly what happened. Psalm 82, as we noted earlier, describes God judging the Elohim who ruled unjustly. These were the spiritual princes over the nations, members of the divine council who had been given authority but had abused it. Subscribe now to discover how this cosmic division of nations leads directly to the calling of Abraham and the formation of Israel as a people reserved for the Most High alone. Daniel 10, which we referenced earlier, describes these territorial spirits in action. The prince of Persia resisted God's messenger. The prince of Greece was rising. Michael, identified as the prince over Israel, fought on behalf of God's purposes. The spiritual realm was divided into territories, with different angelic authorities governing different regions, and these authorities were not all loyal to the Most High. This creates a framework for understanding the Old Testament's emphasis on Israel remaining separate from other nations. It was not ethnic superiority, it was spiritual protection. Israel was directly governed by the Most High, not by a potentially corrupt member of the divine council. Intermarriage, cultural exchange, and religious syncretism were dangerous not merely because they were disobedient, but because they brought Israel under the influence of other spiritual authorities that might be hostile to God's redemptive purposes. The prophets repeatedly condemned Israel for worshipping the gods of the nations, but in the Ethiopian reading, these gods were not mere idols or figments of imagination. They were real spiritual entities, members of the divine council who had become corrupt and were demanding worship that belonged only to the Most High. When Israel worshipped Baal, Asherah, or Molech, they were not worshipping nothing. They were worshipping rebellious Elohim, placing themselves under spiritual authorities opposed to their true king. Babel, then, represents a critical moment in biblical history. It was the point where God divided humanity to prevent collective rebellion and assigned nations to different members of the divine council. Some of those assignments resulted in nations led toward truth. Others resulted in nations led into idolatry. And Israel was established as the nation reserved for the Most High, the people through whom redemption would eventually come to all nations. But the division at Babel was not permanent. The New Testament describes a reversal at Pentecost, where languages were miraculously unified, foreshadowing the eventual restoration of human unity under Christ. Yet before that restoration could happen, there was the matter of covenances, kings, and celestial alliances. Chapter 9. Kings, covenanters, and celestial alliances. The Ethiopian tradition places great emphasis on the relationship between earthly rulers and spiritual powers. This is not unique to Ethiopia. It is a biblical theme often overlooked. Kings in the ancient world were understood to reign not merely by human authority, but by divine appointment. They were representatives of heavenly authority on earth, functioning as mediators between the gods and their people. Abraham's covenant with God established a new kind of relationship. Genesis 12:1-3 records God's call to Abraham. Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. This was not merely a promise of descendants. It was the establishment of a new nation under the direct authority of the Most High, bypassed the corrupted authorities assigned to other nations. But covenanters in the ancient world were not abstract agreements. They were sealed with rituals, sacrifices, and often with bloodlines. Genesis 15 describes the covenant ceremony where God passed between the pieces of sacrificed animals, taking upon himself the covenant obligations. This was a binding commitment, a guarantee that the promises to Abraham would be fulfilled regardless of human failure, and the fulfillment of those promises required maintaining a pure lineage. According to the Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's national epic, the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon, was impressed by his wisdom, and they conceived a son, Menelik. Menelik later traveled to Jerusalem, received the Ark of the Covenant, and brought it to Ethiopia, where it has remained ever since, housed in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum. Whether historically accurate or not, this tradition reflects a deep conviction that Ethiopia is a covenant nation, a people directly connected to the Davidic line and to the promises made to Abraham. This is not arrogance. It is a theological identity that shapes how the Ethiopian church reads scripture. They see themselves as inheritors of the covenant, custodians of sacred traditions, and preservers of texts that other branches of Christianity rejected. King David's importance in biblical history cannot be overstated. 2 Samuel 7 records God's covenant with David, promising that his throne would be established forever. This was not merely a political promise, it was a messianic prophecy. The eternal throne would ultimately be occupied by Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the King who would rule not just Israel but all nations. And the purity of the Davidic line was essential to the fulfillment of this promise. This is why the genealogies in Matthew and Luke matter. They trace Jesus' lineage through David, through Abraham, through Noah, all the way back to Adam. This was not ancient record-keeping. This was proof that Jesus was the legitimate heir to the covenant promises, the uncorrupted descendant of the line through which redemption was promised. Any break in that line, any contamination by Nephilim ancestry would have disqualified him. Like this video, if you are realizing that biblical genealogies are far more significant than you ever imagined, and keep watching as we explore how Jesus' mission was not just about personal salvation, but about dismantling spiritual powers. The Ethiopian tradition's emphasis on lineage extends beyond Israel. They preserve traditions about how the gospel spread to Ethiopia through the Ethiopian eunuch baptized by Philip in Acts 8. They trace their Christian heritage back to the 1st century, claiming an unbroken connection to the Apostolic Church, and they see their preservation of texts like Enoch as evidence that they have maintained elements of truth that other traditions lost. Kings throughout biblical history are presented as entering covenanters with spiritual powers. Some covenanters were righteous, like David's covenant with God. Others were idolatrous, like Ahab's alliances with Baal, worshipped through his marriage to Jezebel. These were not merely political decisions. They were spiritual alignments, commitments that placed entire nations under the influence of specific spiritual authorities. The prophets repeatedly confronted kings who made covenants with foreign powers and their gods. Isaiah condemned Judah's alliance with Egypt. Jeremiah denounced the worship of the Queen of Heaven. Ezekiel described how Israel's idolatry was spiritual adultery, a violation of the covenant relationship with the Most High. These were not metaphors, they were descriptions of real spiritual alignments that had real consequences. The Ethiopian Church's inclusion of texts like Enoch and Jubilees provides a framework for understanding these alliances. The spiritual realm is organized into territories and authorities. Earthly kings align themselves with these authorities, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and these alignments determine the fate of nations. Israel's unique calling was to remain aligned with the Most High alone, rejecting the authority of all other Elohim, no matter how powerful. Yet the ultimate confrontation between earthly powers and spiritual authorities would come through a king unlike any other. Chapter 10, Christ against the powers. The New Testament presents Jesus as the promised Messiah, the Son of David, the fulfillment of all covenant promises. But in the context of the Ethiopian biblical tradition, Jesus is something more. He is the divine invasion, the intervention of the Most High himself into a world dominated by rebellious spiritual powers. His mission was not merely to forgive sins, it was to break the authority of the corrupt Elohim and restore creation to its intended order. Colossians 2:15 describes Jesus' victory on the cross. Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. This is spiritual warfare language. The principalities and powers are not abstract evils. They are the rebellious members of the divine council, the territorial spirits, the corrupt authorities that have dominated humanity since the rebellion of the Watchers. Jesus' death and resurrection defeated them, stripping them of their legal authority over humanity. Ephesians 1:20-21 describes Jesus as seated at the right hand of God, far above all principality and power and might and dominion, and every name that is named. He has been given authority over all spiritual powers, whether loyal or rebellious. He is the King over all kings, the Lord over all lords, the ultimate authority to whom every knee will bow. This is not merely religious language. This is a declaration of cosmic regime change. Jesus' temptation in the wilderness takes on new significance in this context. Satan offered him all the kingdoms of the world if he would worship him. This was not an empty offer. Luke 4:6 records Satan saying, "All this authority I will give you, and their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish." Satan claimed ownership of the world's kingdoms, and Jesus did not dispute the claim. The world systems were under the authority of the prince of this world, a rebellious member of the divine council. But Jesus rejected the offer. He would not gain authority through compromise with evil. He would gain it through obedience, suffering, and resurrection, and his victory would be total, not partial. He would not merely reclaim authority over some nations. He would reclaim authority over all creation, disarming every power that had usurped dominion. Jesus' miracles also demonstrate his authority over the spiritual realm. When he cast out demons, they recognized him and feared him. Mark 1:4-24 records a demon crying out, "What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The demons knew that Jesus' presence signaled the end of their dominion. He was not merely a prophet or a healer. He was the terminator of their rebellion. The crucifixion itself was a moment of cosmic confrontation. Colossians 2:14 describes Jesus having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. The handwriting of requirements refers to the legal charges that spiritual powers held against humanity. Sin gave them legal grounds to accuse and dominate. By taking the punishment for sin upon himself, Jesus removed their legal basis for authority. Comment below if this changes how you understand why Jesus had to die specifically on a cross, as a public spectacle visible to both humans and spiritual powers. The resurrection was the vindication. Death could not hold him. The powers of darkness could not keep him bound. Romans 1:4 states that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. This was not merely a miracle, it was a declaration of victory, proof that the Most High's authority is absolute and that rebellion ultimately fails. The ascension completed the victory. Ephesians 4:8 quotes Psalm 68, "When he ascended on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts to men." The imagery is of a conquering king leading defeated enemies in a triumphal procession. Jesus ascended not merely to heaven, but through the territories of the rebellious powers, demonstrating his superiority and establishing his rule over every realm. Pentecost reversed Babel. At Babel, languages were confused and nations were scattered. At Pentecost, the Holy Spirit enabled people of many languages to understand the gospel message simultaneously. This was not merely a miracle of translation, it was a sign that the division imposed at Babel was being undone. The gospel would go to all nations, reclaiming them from the corrupt authorities assigned at Babel and bringing them back under the authority of the Most High through Christ. The Ethiopian tradition sees the church as the continuation of this mission. The body of Christ is not merely a spiritual community. It is the agent of Christ's ongoing victory over the powers. Ephesians 3:10 states that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. The church's very existence, its unity across ethnic and national boundaries, is a demonstration to the spiritual realm that Christ's victory is real and final. Yet one question remains unanswered. If this story is true, why was it suppressed? Chapter 11. Why this story was buried. The Ethiopian Bible contains truths that most Christians never encounter. It preserves texts that were widely read in the early church but later excluded from Western canons. It maintains interpretations that challenge comfortable theological assumptions, and it raises questions that religious authorities have preferred to avoid. The question we must ask is simple but profound. Why was this version of the biblical story suppressed? The historical answer involves power and control. Early church councils were not merely theological assemblies. They were political gatherings where bishops aligned with imperial interests decided which texts would be authoritative and which would be excluded. The Council of Nicaea in 350 AD, the Council of Laodicea in 363 AD, and the Council of Carthage in 317 I7 AD established canons that served the interests of an increasingly centralized church structure. Texts like Enoch and Jubilees presented problems for this centralization. They emphasized angelic hierarchies, spiritual warfare, and ongoing cosmic conflict. They suggested that spiritual authority was complex, contested, and not entirely settled. This was uncomfortable for church leaders who wanted to present a unified, orderly system with clear lines of authority. It was easier to exclude these texts than to address the theological challenges they presented. The Ethiopian church, geographically isolated and politically independent, was not subject to these pressures. They never attended the councils that excluded Enoch and Jubilees. They continued to read, copy, and revere these texts as scripture. And when Western scholars eventually encountered the Ethiopian Bible, they dismissed it as a curiosity, an eccentric variant of no real importance. But the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. When fragments of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, written in Aramaic and dating to the centuries before Christ, it became undeniable that this text was ancient. Jewish and widely respected in the Second Temple period. It was not a Christian invention or an Ethiopian addition. It was part of the biblical literature circulating among Jews in the time of Jesus. And if Jesus and his apostles knew this text, if Jude quoted it in the New Testament, then excluding it from the canon was a theological decision, not a historical necessity. The theological answer for the suppression is even more troubling. The version of biblical history preserved in the Ethiopian tradition is unsettling. It suggests that spiritual warfare is literal, ongoing, and dangerous. It implies that human history has been shaped by conflicts among divine beings with agendas we do not fully understand. It challenges the neat monotheism that much of Western theology prefers, introducing a complex divine council with members who can rebel, fail, and be judged. Share this video to help others discover the biblical tradition that was hidden for centuries and ask why it was kept from us. This worldview also has practical implications. If rebellious spiritual powers are real and active, then the Church's mission is not merely to preach personal salvation. It is to engage in spiritual warfare, to resist and defeat these powers through Christ's authority. This is a more demanding, more dangerous vision of Christianity than what is often presented in modern churches. It requires believers to take seriously the reality of the spiritual realm and to understand their role in a cosmic conflict. The Ethiopian tradition also emphasizes the importance of genealogy, covenant, and maintaining spiritual purity. This can be uncomfortable in a modern context that values individualism and personal choice, but the biblical worldview, especially as preserved in Ethiopia, is communal and covenantal. It sees individuals as part of larger narratives, larger lineages, larger spiritual conflicts. Personal decisions have communal and even cosmic consequences. Another reason for suppression may be the challenge these texts pose to simplistic interpretations of God's character. The God of Enoch and Jubilees is not a distant, abstract deity. He is actively involved in cosmic governance, delegating authority to created beings, holding them accountable when they fail, and intervening dramatically when necessary. This is a more complex, more dynamic understanding of God than much of contemporary theology allows. The flood, the conquest of Canaan, the division at Babel, and the binding of rebellious angels are all presented as necessary actions in a larger strategic plan to preserve humanity and establish a redeemed people. This challenges modern sensibilities that prefer a God who never judges, never destroys, and never uses force. But the Ethiopian tradition does not apologize for these aspects of the biblical narrative. It presents them as evidence of God's commitment to his redemptive purposes, even when the cost is high. The final reason for suppression may be fear of the implications. If the Ethiopian reading is correct, then humanity is not the center of the cosmos. We are participants in a much larger story involving beings far more powerful than ourselves. Our actions have spiritual consequences we do not fully understand. And the conflict between good and evil is not merely moral but metaphysical, involving forces that can influence genetics, nations, and even the course of history itself. This is a worldview that requires humility, vigilance, and dependence on God's revelation. It does not allow for human autonomy or self-sufficiency. It insists that we are always and everywhere surrounded by spiritual realities that we cannot see, but that profoundly affect us. And it calls believers to align themselves with the Most High, rejecting the authority of all other powers, no matter how attractive or powerful they may seem. The Ethiopian Bible has been preserved for a reason. It contains perspectives that the global church needs to recover. It challenges us to read Scripture with fresh eyes, to ask difficult questions, and to take seriously the full scope of biblical revelation. The story it tells is not comfortable, but it is biblical, and it may be the story we need to hear in an age when spiritual warfare is as real as ever, even if most believers no longer recognize it. The question now is what we will do with this knowledge. Will we dismiss it as ancient mythology, or will we allow it to reshape how we understand our faith, our world, and our place in the cosmic story that began long before us and will continue long after?